Salvete discipuli. Today we're going to continue discussing the Punic Wars fought between Rome and Carthage, this time beginning our discussion of the Second Punic War fought from 218 to 201 BCE. We ended our discussion in the last video on the First Punic War with the peace treaty terms between ancient Rome and Carthage, and specifically that 3,200 talent silver indemnity that Rome required Carthage to pay. Now, this caused a lot of financial difficulties for the Carthaginian Empire, not only because it was unable to pay its mercenary soldiers, resulting in a revolt, but also because they had really no means of paying such a heavy fee to the Romans. As a result, in the time between the wars, Carthage needed to find a way to come up with some money so that they could pay Rome the monies due to them. As a result, they sent Hamilcar Barca, the leader of the Carthaginians from the First Punic War, to modern-day Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. It was his task to set up and found the city of New Carthage on the southern coast. And while there, he had two primary tasks. The first was to conquer additional territories for the Carthaginian Empire, since they lost the islands of Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia after the First Punic War. And the second, and probably more important task, was for Hamilcar to set up trading routes to the silver mines that dotted the southern coast of Spain during that time. And this was all in an effort to pay Rome the indemnity that was required of them for the First Punic War peace treaty terms. Hamilcar decided to take his son Hannibal Barca with him, who at that time was only 9 years old. Before he allowed his son to set sail with him, he required his son Hannibal to swear an oath on an altar to the Carthaginian gods that he would never be a friend to the Romans. Our sources indicate that there may have been an alternative oath that Hamilcar required his son Hannibal to swear, that being always be an enemy to the Romans. And while there is a huge difference between never being a friend to someone and always being an enemy to that same person, whatever the oath that Hannibal was required to swear gives an indication that Hannibal would continue in his hostile perceptions of the Romans. So while Hamilcar and his son Hannibal are setting up these trading routes in southern Spain, Rome started to become more and more suspicious and concerned as to the intentions of Hamilcar and his army that he brought with him as he was conquering that territory in the Iberian Peninsula. The most notable emissary mission in 231 BCE resulted in Hamilcar effectively putting Roman fears to rest. When the emissaries asked him about his intentions, Hamilcar replied that the Carthaginians and his army were only doing what was necessary to make sure that Rome was paid the fee that they were due from the First Punic War. The emissaries were then sent on their way, with all assurances given. Now, whether or not Hamilcar had any alternative plans, such as re-engaging hostilities between Carthage and Rome, is unknown, because a mere 2 years later, Hamilcar died, leaving a young Hannibal in charge of New Carthage and the armies stationed there. And it is during this time, while Hannibal was the leader of the armies, that a number of altercations occurred between Roman allies in southern Gaul, or southern modern-day France, and the Carthaginians, who then mounted expeditions against those allies, causing growing concerns once again for Rome and the intentions of the army in southern Spain. However, while these altercations were a precursor to the beginnings of the Second Punic War, they did not in fact start the Second Punic War fought between 218 and 201 BCE. The start of the Second Punic War is famously told by a story of Hannibal marching his army overland from New Carthage across the Alps with the eventual goal of besieging the city of Rome itself. However, part of his military strategy was to create an element of surprise, which explains why he didn't sail his troops over to Rome, which would have been a much shorter route and a much more effective use of his troops. He assumed that Rome would anticipate such an attack and would line its troops up outside the city of Rome to defend it. So instead, he marched his troops overland and famously crossed the Alps, bringing with him 30 or 40 war elephants. In addition to these war elephants, sources indicate that he had approximately 45,000 foot soldiers with him as well. Unfortunately, part of the strategy of surprise that Hannibal used when crossing the Alps was that he crossed the Alps during winter, and this resulted in the loss of over half of his army, and Hannibal wound up arriving in Italy with a mere 20,000 of his initial troops and perhaps only a few of those war elephants. As a result, Hannibal no longer had the necessary men to make a direct path towards Rome and besiege the capital straight away. Instead, he decided to change his strategy and mount a number of quick expeditions in the smaller cities on the way to the capital city of Rome. The battle at Lake Trasimene is one such example, and it was a major Carthaginian victory. If you compare the Roman and Carthaginian losses, the Romans lost 15,000 men in this single battle alone, compared to the Carthaginian loss of only 1,500 men, a 10-to-1 ratio. While not all of Hannibal's victories were so overwhelming, part of Hannibal's new strategy in mounting these quick expeditions was to draw the Romans out and convince the Roman allies, the cities that he was attacking, that Rome was unable to defend them, thus hopefully prompting them to not only revolt against Rome, but to join his forces instead, giving him once again the necessary numbers to besiege the city of Rome itself. As I said before, not all of Hannibal's victories were as overwhelming as the Battle of Lake Trasimene. However, it is known that Hannibal never once lost a single battle in Italy. Time and time again, Hannibal would attack one of those Italian allies, and time again, Rome would send troops to defend those cities only to lose, sometimes horrifically, such as with the Battle of Lake Trasimene. All of this indicates that Carthage should have won the Second Punic War, but it is Rome who emerges victorious. And that is because a number of things that Hannibal didn't have as a result of his crossing the Alps with his troops in the middle of winter. We've already discussed the fact that he didn't have a large enough army to immediately attack and besiege the city of Rome itself. In addition to that, by crossing the Alps in the middle of winter, he lost a lot of his siege weapon materials. Typically in antiquity, it is the practice to carry siege weapon materials with you and only start constructing those weapons, such as catapults and battering rams, when you arrive at the location you're going to attack. So not only did Hannibal not have enough men to attack Rome, but he didn't have the necessary weapons to make any type of attack successful. As a result, he changed his strategy and started mounting those quick expeditions in efforts to make the Italian cities revolt against Rome and swell his own ranks. However, contrary to his expectations, the Italians did not actually revolt against Rome, thus once again preventing him from besieging Rome due to a lack of men. Despite the fact that the Italians did not wind up revolting, the Romans were still shaking in their sandals. Not once against Hannibal were they able to emerge victorious, and as a result, they needed to come up with some counter strategies to negate the effects that Hannibal was having in Italy. They called upon their leading general, a man called Publius Cornelius Scipio, who, as we can tell by his nomen, was one of our ancestors of our Ecce Romani Cornelian family. And Publius Cornelius Scipio was first sent from Rome to the southern coast of Spain in order to mimic Hannibal's own strategy against him by mounting quick expeditions against those raw recruits that Hannibal left in Spain to guard his Spanish territory. All of this was in an effort to draw Hannibal away from Italy, mitigating the losses that the Romans repeatedly suffered from being unable to defend the cities that Hannibal was attacking. Unfortunately, this strategy was unsuccessful in Spain, and Rome then sent Publius Cornelius Scipio to the northern coast of Africa in the territory immediately surrounding the capital of Carthage itself to once again mount a number of quick expeditions, hopefully in an effort to draw Hannibal away from Italy. This time, however, with the threat so much closer to their capital city, the Roman counter strategy was effective and Hannibal was recalled to Carthage. After a number of skirmishes, the two famously met at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE. Both men, of course, were supremely gifted in military strategy, and so for a while the Battle of Zama was very closely fought between the two armies. However, Publius Cornelius Scipio made effective use of his superior cavalry, not only to rout the Carthaginian cavalry, but to then mount a second attack from the rear, flanking the foot soldiers left of the Carthaginian army, resulting in a victory for the Romans at the Battle of Zama, and the end of the Second Punic War with Rome emerging victorious. As a result of the Second Punic War, one of the repercussions is that the Carthaginians lost the vast majority of their empire, their territory. Previous to the Second Punic War, the Carthaginians controlled the vast majority of the northern coast of Africa, as well as the territory in modern-day Spain that Hamilcar had conquered. After the end of the Second Punic War, due to the efforts of Publius Cornelius Scipio, that territory in Spain was now in Roman control, and Carthaginian territory was effectively reduced to just the northern coast of Tunisia in northern Spain. In addition to that, Rome also required of Carthage truly humiliating peace treaty terms, the first being that Carthage cannot raise its own army without Rome's permission. So that means if somebody, a neighbor, were to attack Carthage, they would not be able to raise their own army in defense without first sending an emissary to Rome and then waiting for a response back from Rome. In addition to not being able to raise their own army, the Romans cut off and restricted the Carthaginian navy to a total of 10 ships. And if you remember from the First Punic War discussion, the vast majority of Carthaginian might came from their naval power, not just in terms of military strength, but also in their ability to create a trading empire. By restricting the Carthaginian navy to 10 ships, Rome effectively reduced their navy to such an extent that they could no longer send out ships as a means of trade, creating once again a financial crisis for the much restricted Carthaginian Empire. In addition to this, the Romans also required that Carthage once again pay an indemnity, this time for a period of 50 years. If you recall from the First Punic War, after the end of the First Punic War, Carthage was required to pay a total of 3,200 talents of silver, split out evenly over a period of 10 years. Now, after the Second Punic War, the Romans required the Carthaginians to pay a total of 10,000 talents of silver, this time over a period of 50 years. Now, at first glance, it seems that the indemnity required of Carthage after the Second Punic War is by far more massive, 10,000 being a larger number. However, if you look at the per annua requirement, it does turn out that a smaller amount is required per year after the Second Punic War. This time period of 50 years is especially important to note as we begin our discussion of the cause of the Third Punic War in our next video. As a result of his military actions in ending the Second Punic War, Publius Cornelius Scipio is given the honor of a cognomen for his family, that of Africanus, in reference to his military expeditions in Africa. And it is also Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus who is primarily responsible for making Hannibal a leader of Carthage after the war. And this was in part to ensure that Carthage would in fact fulfill the terms of its peace treaty. However, after many years of Hannibal's success, Rome started to become disenfranchised with his success as a leader for the Carthaginians, and in 195 BCE, Rome attempted assassination of Hannibal. Hannibal escaped with his life but needed to flee to Carthage, and in the years that followed, Rome continued to send assassination attempts against him, to the effect that in 183 BCE, Hannibal finally commits suicide by poison. This ends the discussion of the Second Punic War fought between Rome and Carthage. If you would like, there are 3 additional video links underneath your survey for this video if you would like greater detail into the workings of the Second Punic War. Otherwise, Walete Discipuli.